Hello and welcome to this tutorial on composing with open music. Today we're going to be taking a look at the profile library. But first I just wanted to mention, as always, if you have found these videos useful or helpful, do consider offering some support. You can do that in any of the following ways. First of all, I always appreciate it when folks subscribe. That gives you the option to be notified when new videos are available. Additionally, if you are interested, I also do appreciate support on Ko-fi. That is just a very easy and simple way that you can offer some financial support. So again, the links to both of those options will be given in the description of the video just down below. And finally, if you are interested, I do also offer a newsletter entitled Creativity and Constraint. This newsletter features some brief essays regarding my interest in music composition, in thinking about constraint techniques, and just general topics in computer music, technology, and many other ideas. The most recent edition of this newsletter gave a quick overview of this incredible software by Dr. Benjamin Hackbarth entitled Audio Guide. Audio Guide is software for concatenative sound synthesis. It's very powerful and very fun to explore, so I hope you'll take a look at that. And the next edition of the newsletter will be taking a look at another program called Obsidian. Obsidian is very popular with individuals all over the world. It's software for taking hyperlinked, interconnected notes in a markdown format. And I've used it now for a number of years, both in my own personal life, in my work, and in my work as a composer, and I found it extremely helpful. So the next edition of the Creativity and Constraint newsletter will be taking a look at doing a listening session, doing some score study, opening up Obsidian, taking some notes, and ways that has been helpful for me to just keep some reminders of the pieces that I have been listening to and studying. So links for all of those different opportunities are available in the description below. And with that, we'll dive right into today's topic. We're going to be taking a look at the profile library. This library was first developed in 1994, and the creators of this library, and again, I'll put some description in the description box below, but the creators of this library were very interested in codifying and formalizing some ways that composers engage gesture and intuition in their compositional work. And so we'll take a look at a couple of functions from this library. I don't know that we'll get to covering the entire scope of the library in today's video, but I think we'll make a good start. So with that, let's begin. All right, so I think we're ready to begin diving into this library. As always with these library videos, I find it helpful to begin just by taking a look at some of the documentation that's available. And so the link to this PDF will be in the description below. It's also available on the GitHub page for the profile library. So if you're looking for it, that's a good place to start. It's very useful and helpful documentation. It gives just a brief overview. Actually, I'll start here. It gives a brief overview of the categories of the functions, the various boxes that are available in the library in open music. So it's grouped into these different categories here. And then it dives into a little summary of the purpose of the library. And as you can see, it's really concerned with looking at melodic contour, and with looking at kind of these gestural sorts of materials, specifically in the pitch domain. So that's the general overview of the documentation. Again, it's very detailed. Most of the examples for various functions will have some accompanying diagrams or some accompanying examples. And so the examples that we will be looking at today mostly are taken from this documentation, just as a way of testing it for myself and seeing what it can do. Also, I mentioned Obsidian briefly in the introduction to this video, and I'll just mention again here that I found it extremely helpful as I was looking through this documentation and experimenting a little bit, just to take some notes in my own words, things that I will be able to return to and understand for myself And so that's just another use of this software. So with that, we will go ahead and dive into the first of these examples. And this is not exactly in the order of the documentation, but we will just go sort of step by step here through these examples. So to begin with, this is the alea-pertb function, short for perturbation. And if you'll remember, we've discussed the alea library briefly. That's actually a separate library, but as you would expect if you're familiar with aleatoric music, the alea library is mostly concerned with functions involving some degree of chance or randomness. And so here in the profile library, this is just a function that will add a certain amount of random perturbation to individual pitch materials within the set that you feed to this little function, and you can specify as the user the parameters for how wide you would like the pitch material to diverge from the original. So here we have this original pitch material up at the top left. If we were to test the output here in the listener, we would see that it's appearing as a list of lists. And so the thing that we'll want to do is actually begin by flattening that list and then feeding it into this little box down here. It'll take a list as the first inlet, and then this second inlet is for the range. And this is a number expressed in MIDI cents, I believe. We'll test that and confirm. Yes. So we can see I'm looking here, for example, at this B shown right here at the top. And here, if we take a look at the range, it's reaching at the most the D above, and at the least the G sharp down below, each of those being 3 semitones away from that B. So that's one way that you can use that function. If you'll note, I've used an OM round box here, and if I were to bypass that and patch the result directly into this chord sequence box without first rounding, you'll see that we actually get microtonal output. And so that can actually be very helpful if you're looking at getting a result that's even more granular, even more specific. But for just testing here, I found it helpful to set this particular inlet, the number of decimal places to round to -2, and that will ensure that the output is always in denominations of 100 MIDI cents, or a half step. So that's just a brief example of that alea-pertb function. We'll go ahead and take a look now at this next one. This is a function that allows you to either compress or expand the pitch material that you feed into this function. So here we can see again, we're beginning by just taking a moment to flatten the result, and that feeds into this function here. And I've indicated again a number, and that's just like an index of how much we're going to compress or expand. So if I were to leave it at 1 exactly, you'll notice that the result that's output by this function is just the same as the input that I fed to the function. So then any values greater than 1 are going to expand that pitch material in pitch space. So if I were to enter a 2 here, we'll give this a try. Yes. And we can see that we've greatly expanded the tessitura of this material. On the other hand, I can enter in a 0.5, and we'll see that that is now compressed. And again, the same sort of thing applies with regard to the use of this OM round function. So if I bypass that, you'll notice again that I get a microtonal output. So this next example shows us the use of the control perturbation function that you can see just here. And I'm going to begin taking a look at this here by connecting this chord sequence box and it just has a couple of repeated middle C pitch entries here that are then flattened. And that goes into this first inlet of this control perturbation box. The second inlet is used to specify very precisely the amount of perturbation that we would like applied to each item in the list. So if we evaluate this, we can see basically this is just functioning to transpose. And so here we're transposing down a semitone, up a semitone and a half, and then down 2 semitones and up 2 semitones. That's applied to each of these items in sequence. Finally, this last inlet is specifying a factor, and that's just an amount that will be multiplied by each of these little perturbation indexes, so or indices rather, I suppose. So here, if I change this to 2, we'll see that each of these amounts is doubled. I don't have to use an integer amount either. I could do something like 1.75, and we would see again that it will process that just as well. And note again that you can just take the result directly with some microtonal output, or you can use an OM round function to kind of corral the pitch material back into 12-tone equal temperament, depending on your use case. The other thing that I'll mention is that this second item, this index inlet, can take a BPF object itself passed into that inlet. And what the control perturbation function will do is simply sample this BPF object at multiple points along the way. And we'll just use that as basically the entries in the list that we had over here on the left. So we can see, and let me change this back to a factor of 1 here, we can see that indeed this is doing a very similar thing. In this case, everything is being transposed upwards slightly, and that's because if we were to look at this BPF object, we would actually see that the origin is all the way down here at 0. And so the values for each of these items are all positive. That's the reason why they're all being transposed upwards slightly. If I wanted to, I could modify this. So in fact, let me just draw a continuous curve here. And actually, I'm gonna move this up just a little bit. So we'll have some crossing of the x-axis as well. But I'll just draw a continuous curve for how I might imagine the pitch material to be adjusted, transposed. And here we can see that we get a result that actually follows that curve pretty nicely. So I'm going to change the factor here, and we'll see that even more starkly. We get pitch material that is following that degree of perturbation specified by the continuous function in the BPF box just above. And again, if you're interested, you can take either the microtonal output of that box, or you can pass it through an OM round function. I think I specified earlier, but usually I set this decimal inlet to -2, and that's the way that I can ensure that it will round to the nearest 100 and keep the value in terms of millicents. So the last thing that I will specify here as we're talking about this is that in these examples that we were looking at, we were just using this repeated pitch material. But of course, you can use any pitch material that you find interesting and apply these very same processes to it. And so here, for example, if we were to redraw this BPF curve to be something like this, where for a while we stay very close to 0 before. Actually, let me just delete all of that. There we go. If we were to specify a curve where we stay very close to 0 for most of the time, but then have a dramatic downward trajectory before returning, we could see the effect that will have is that most of the pitch material that's specified here in this chord sequence box will align pretty nicely until we get to somewhere, maybe 3/5 of the middle into our material, and those pitches will be transposed downward somewhat significantly. So here, if we compare, we can see that most of it is right on track. Actually, let me change the factor, and we'll see this even more dramatically. We'll change that to 5. So if we were to compare these two chord sequence boxes, we can see that beginning with F sharp, D sharp, C sharp, we're pretty much on track. And then we do begin to see a fairly dramatic downward perturbation with the F sharp, with the B up there, and then the D. All of those are fairly dramatically transposed downward before returning to just about the same pitch material that we had earlier. There may be some very small microtonal adjustments. Let's actually take a look. Yeah, so we can see here this last E is actually off by just a very small amount. Nothing that is actually displayed here in the notation exactly, but if we were to audition this chord sequence box, we would hear that it was just a little bit off from a 12-tone equal temperament. In any case, all of that is to say that this function allows the user to specify very precisely any amount of sort of digression away from the pitch material that you use. And so I can envision a number of different applications for something like this. Perhaps if you're constructing a passage involving heterophony with some doublings or triplings of a single melodic line, and you want points at which there's more or there's less digression from that kind of central melodic line, this could be a very, very helpful function for achieving that effect. All right, so this next function in the profile library is somewhat difficult to describe. I'm going to start by reading a quotation from the documentation for this function. The documentation states, "The derivation function performs the musical transcription of a derivation, or a derivative from calculus, as applied to a melodic profile." So what this function is really attempting to do is capture just the intervals between each of these pitch items, capture that. And the interesting thing about this is that it, if you remember to calculus how you can take subsequent derivatives of the same mathematical object, you can do the same thing here. So we'll get into this in just a moment, but down here this is representing something like the first degree derivative of this melodic contour. And here I can enter in 2 or 3 or 4 and see how that changes. It actually is kind of further and further abstracting this idea of melodic contour as it goes. So let's just take a quick look at what this is doing. I'm going to skip a description of this second inlet. It has to do with ways that you might use this function in tandem with an inverse function, an integration function that's part of the profile library. So you can take some material and apply several layers of derivation, and you could then take the inverse by integrating back. And this is a way that the library allows you to kind of traverse up and down those different degrees of abstraction of a melodic contour. If you're interested, the documentation gives a description of that. I'm going to go ahead and skip it for this video and just leave this inlet at 1, which is the setting that we'll want to use. So what this is doing, again, if we take a look at this chord sequence object up here at the top, I've actually expressed these intervals in terms of MIDI sense, so you can take a look at what is going on there. But the output comes in sort of two parts. The first part is a list of MIDI cents that you can see here in the chord sequence object on the left. And then the very last element is all by itself, just a little atom, the second element of this list. And it's also a single pitch represented in MIDI cents. And so if we take a look at this, basically how we arrive at the material here on the left is by starting with 7 repeated F sharps. So we have 8 pitch elements in this chord sequence up here. And if we're attempting to evaluate the intervals in between each successive pitch, that'll leave us with 7 intervals. So this function is starting by populating 7 of these F sharps. Now, this F sharp is perhaps a little arbitrary. The documentation says that this note is sort of the center of gravity of these other pitch objects over here in the chord sequence on the left. I'm not entirely sure how it is that this function arrives at centering the results all on this F sharp. But I will mention that if you don't like the pitch material that is output and would like it centered around a different note as the sort of center of gravity, you can of course just transpose the results indicated here on the left. So if we imagine 7 of these F sharps all in a row, what this function is doing is then applying the intervals found between each of these successive pitches and re-expressing that as a transposition level. So from F sharp, we go down 3 semitones, just like we have here in this list. We're then going to go up 10 semitones from F sharp. We're going to go up 5 semitones from F sharp, up 11 semitones from F sharp, etc. And so really, again, all that it is doing is just analyzing the distances from pitch to pitch in terms of intervals expressed in MIDI cents. It's picking, again, a somewhat arbitrary pitch to be a sort of center of gravity or a baseline at 0. And then it's applying that contour that it was analyzing from the melodic material up here and expressing it again as pitch material. So just to try and elucidate this, let's just do this. I'm going to unselect that and copy and paste. And we can apply this entire process all over again and evaluate it and see what results. So our center of gravity in this case has shifted down a bit. And I have been curious, I have wondered if the center of gravity is actually just defined by the very first pitch, the very first index here in the list, and that could be the case. Here we have a D sharp to begin with, and that is the center of gravity specified by this instance of the function. But again, we could evaluate what this is doing. So if we were to, here, let me just output that. So here, this E is 6,400 in MIDI cents. So that's going to be 1,300 up from the D sharp just above. So our first transposition level up from this D will be by 1,300 MIDI cents. So 1,200 MIDI cents would just be an octave up, and a half step above that is this E, so we can confirm that that is indeed what it is doing. It's analyzing the intervals between subsequent pitches in this melodic contour, and then expressing those again as new pitch material relative to this sort of baseline that the function has established. So that's all that this function is doing. It's, I think, a very interesting way of considering the sort of essence of a melodic line and then abstracting away from that further and further. The last thing that I will mention is that, of course, this profile library was created with pitch material in mind, but there's no reason that in the application of these functions you would need to limit yourself to pitch material. So I could imagine scenarios where it might be very interesting and very fruitful to take a melodic contour such as this to then output a list of, that list, we would have to perhaps scale it so that it's not expressed in MIDI sense. But you could output a list of intervals, scale it appropriately, and then perhaps apply that to something like a rhythm parameter, or envision a way of expressing timbre in terms of a list in open music and apply it to that parameter of your material and of your composition. So I think it's a very flexible sort of function, and I can envision a lot of potential uses. I'm curious to know if you have any thoughts specifically about this function. We'll take a look at in a little bit at the integration function, which again is the inverse of this derivation function. I'm going to stop this video here for the sake of time, but the next video that will be released will continue right where we left off, looking at the profile library in OpenMusic. In the meantime, again, if you're interested, do take a moment to subscribe to the channel, considering buying me a coffee, or perhaps subscribing to my Creativity and Constraint newsletter. Finally, if there are questions that you have about the profile library, or any comments or suggestions for future topics or libraries to explore, do let me know, and I'll look forward to reading your comments.